name's Jeff Urban. I am a college graduate, and I'm speaking to you from Hyde Park, New York, which is about an hour and a half north of New York City. And I want to thank all of the partners who are involved in this program and presentation. But most of all, I want to thank all of you students for taking some time out of your day and visiting the Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum. And I also want to thank all of the teachers for preparing the students so well. So I'm at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. What I'd like to do today is to tell you a little bit about how it is that we came to be, and then talk a little bit about President Roosevelt and some of the programs and things that he was involved with, and how he sort of expanded presidential power over the course of his term. And then the coolest part is we're going to open it up to questions and answers, and you folks out there are going to be able to have an opportunity to ask questions and sort of cross-examine some of the presentation that I've given. So the concept of presidential libraries themselves actually goes back to George Washington, our nation's first president. And he knew that he was the first president ever, and nobody had ever had the job of president of the United States before. So he wasn't quite sure how to do the job, and he was very, very careful as he went along, because he knew that everything he was doing was setting a precedent or a tradition that might be followed by presidents who followed him. So that was one thing. So one of the things that he did was he served for 2 terms, and then he retired the presidency. He let somebody else have a chance. And that created a 2-term traditional limit. It wasn't a law, but by tradition, presidents generally served for 2 terms and then let somebody else run for president. That was until Franklin Roosevelt, who actually served for 4 terms. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another thing that he did was he said, well, gee, how can I best prepare presidents to take over this job? And he did it very much like what you guys might do. You folks, when you're getting ready to take a class, you might ask, well, what's Mrs. McGillicuddy like, before you get into her class? Does she give a lot of homework? Are there a lot of quizzes? Does she do assign a lot of reading and such? And you want to get a sense of what's going on in the class before you actually get there. And the best way that George Washington thought that he could do that would be to take all of his papers with him when he left office and make those available to future presidents. So if you have an older brother or sister who's got your current teacher, maybe you've seen some of their spelling tests or some of their science worksheets and those types of things, and it makes you a little bit more prepared as you go in. So what Washington did was he packed up all of his charts and graphs and books and memos and maps, and he took them back to Mount Vernon with the hope of organizing them so they could be used by future presidents. But unfortunately, he died before he had a chance to organize those papers. And with him died the concept of the Presidential Library. In fact, folks, many of George Washington's papers were actually destroyed. They were eaten by rats. And the rats came in and they ate the documents because the documents were written on such tasty parchment paper that the poor rats just couldn't help themselves. So we lost a lot of our presidential history. Hey, get out of there. From Washington all the way up to Roosevelt, much of our presidential history has been lost. Either it was placed in wet, damp basements, which are not good conditions for documents, or it was placed in hot, dry attics, which are also not good for documents. Sometimes, if a document had a presidential signature on it, the signature might be cut off, sold for its autograph value, and the document simply discarded. There's also reports that Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, destroyed a lot of Abraham Lincoln's papers. Robert Todd Lincoln became a big shot in the Pullman Railroad Company, and it was kind of uncool to have a dad that was born in a log cabin. So Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a big fan of history, wanted to preserve this presidential history, and he wanted to prevent this sort of thing from happening. So he called the Library of Congress and he said, I'm president here during the Great Depression, a very important time in American history. Would you like my documents when I leave office so that we can have these as a record of what went on during this very important time in American history? And when he told them how many he had, the Library of Congress said, we just don't have space. We don't have the room. And so what they decided to do was Roosevelt said, well, you know what? I'm going to build my own presidential library because I don't want my collection split up. I want everything kept in one spot. So he built his own presidential library, and he sketched it out on a yellow legal pad just like this. Let's see if we can, whoops. Wrong cue. Sorry about that. So this is a sketch, and it's dated April 12th, 1937. And FDR sketched this out on a yellow legal pad. He wanted the building to look like this. He wanted it to have large sloping roofs, nice big windows on the bottom, a nice inviting porch, and these little hash marks, he wanted these to be representing stone, Dutchess County fieldstone, stone that's found right here in the fields. He used that to surface the outside of his building. So from this rough draft and sketch, this building was created. And this is the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. And you'll notice it's got many of the features FDR had wanted. It's got the large sloping roof. There's big windows down here. It's built around a nice courtyard. And it's covered in that Dutchess County fieldstone that he had wanted to have placed around there. This is a picture of FDR outside the building on the day of the dedication. And this is our 75th anniversary. So in June, it's going to be, this library will be 75 years old. And here's FDR right out in front making a speech to the people who had gathered there at the dedication all those years ago. Now, some people might say, well, you know, what kinds of things do you have in a presidential library? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But in our collection, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, we have 17.5 million pages of documents. Now, raise your hand if you've ever seen the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. Have you ever seen that? How many folks have seen that? Right? Okay. So you know that the Washington Monument is a pretty tall building. It's actually 555 feet tall. In our collection, that 17.5 million pages of documents would be a stack not as tall as the Washington Monument, not as tall as two Washington monuments, but if you stacked all of our papers on top of each other, it would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument. That's a lot of documents, and that's a lot of papers. Now, currently, there are 13 presidential libraries in the presidential library system. And this chart shows the presidential library system as it exists today. I'm going to just move the president's head out of the way there. So I'm speaking to you here from the Roosevelt Presidential Library, which is about an hour and a half north of New York City. And our friends from Massachusetts are over here. You guys have got a presidential library, the Kennedy Library, outside of Boston. And our folks from Arizona are way out here. You don't have any presidential libraries out there in your neck of the woods yet. Maybe one of you folks will become president and build your presidential library out there. Now, there's 13 presidential libraries in the presidential library system right now. Who do you think is currently getting ready to build a presidential library? Anybody want to take a guess? How about right there in the front with the monkey on your shirt?
President Obama.
Yes, President Obama, because he's got just about a year left in office. Now, where do you think he's going to build his presidential library? Do you know? Anybody know?
Hawaii.
Hawaii, that's right. And that's not right, actually. That's what I wanted it to be right. It's not going to be Hawaii. That was in the running for a while there. But you know what he's picked? He's picked Chicago. Chicago. And I was so confident that he was going to pick Hawaii that I went out and I bought about 3 dozen Hawaiian shirts so that I could transfer out to his presidential library, and then he goes and he puts it in Chicago. So much for that. But that will be our 14th presidential library. Now, what kinds of things might you find in a presidential library? Well, it basically comes down to 3 types of categories. There's documents, there's photographs, and there's artifacts. And so some of the documents you might find, like would be this one here, and this is a document which is in fact FDR's birth certificate. Okay, it actually is his birth announcement. Let me get rid of these here. So this is FDR's birth announcement. Oop, I did it again. Sorry about that. And you see here, this is the stork who's bringing FDR. It's right there, written on there by his dad, the initials FDR. And he's to deliver this baby to Hyde Park, New York, and he's going to do it on January 30th, 1882. So that's when our story starts here, when FDR is born. So that's a copy of his birth announcement. We also have in our collection a copy of his report card. And this is his report card from Groton School, which was over in Massachusetts, where our friends from McCann Tech are. And you'll notice that the president, you would think the president would get really good grades, right? Like mostly A's if you're a really good president. But President Roosevelt got mostly B's and C's. So if you're not doing so well in school just yet, keep working at it, and maybe you can become president as well. And you have to work really hard in school and try to do well, because if you become president, they're going to be looking at your report cards. They're going to be looking at your birth announcements. So be careful with the kinds of things that you put out there. You also might find documents like this. And this is a document. It's the program from the state visit of the King and Queen, who visited the United States in June of 1939. And the thing about this document is that you're also going to see in here, they listed the menu of what the King and Queen were going to eat when they came here to visit. And on this menu, the second thing down is hot dogs. So they served the King and Queen of England hot dogs. How many folks out there like hot dogs? Yeah. And yeah, me too, right? And the Queen didn't know how to eat a hot dog. She didn't even refer to it as a hot dog. She referred to it as a sausage. And the President Roosevelt had to teach her, well, you pick it up with your hands and you just, begin to chew and you enjoy it. And she liked it so much, reports are, that she had 2 hot dogs that day. You're also going to find historic documents like this. And this is what we call the Day of Infamy Speech. I'm going to see if I can zero in on this a little bit. This was back when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. This was the speech that FDR gave. It's called the Day of Infamy Speech. And it's from December 7th, 1941. So you can see the date up here. And FDR dictated this speech to his secretary. She typed it up. And then she gave it to him, and he made these hand corrections on there. And it's called the Day of Infamy Speech because he'd originally written world history, and then he crossed that out and he wrote infamy up there. But the thing that I find so exciting about this is not the word infamy, but the very first word in the sentence, and that is the word yesterday. Because what this shows you is that the president had almost 16 or 20 hours before he addressed the nation. The attack happened on December 7th, but he gives the speech the next day on December 8th. And so, he's had some time to think about this. And that's really important because, when you get involved with a situation, sometimes you got to think things through. I mean, how many times have you said or done something that you didn't think, think it through, and you wish the next day that maybe you hadn't said or done that? Well, that's a very dangerous situation. So the president had some time to think about it. So those are some documents that you're likely to find. You're also going to find some artifacts. In our collection, we even have things like the president's dog toys. The president had a dog named Fowler, and some of his stuff is saved in our collection in terms of artifacts. So this is Fowler's dog toy and ball. And I want to ask you, what do you think this is? Any ideas? Anybody want to venture a guess?
I think it's a lampshade.
A lampshade. Okay. Anybody else want to venture a guess? Anybody at McCann Tech?
Can you guys mute us?
How about there in the back?
Dave, what do you got?
I think it's a lamp. I mean, not a lamp, a hat.
A hat? Well, you're getting closer. A lot of people think this is a lampshade, but what this is, folks, is a Japanese Army helmet from World War II. Now, it's made out of bamboo, and it's held on the soldier's head with just these burlap strings. And this will show you how desperate the Japanese were to get steel and oil. That's why they attacked Pearl Harbor. They attacked Pearl Harbor because we had an American naval base there that they wanted to knock out of commission so that they could then overtake the other countries in the Pacific Rim and get the steel that they had and the oil that they had, because they were sending their troops into battle with bamboo helmets. So something like this really drives home the point of what those folks were looking to do and why they were trying to do it. Most people do think it is a lampshade, but it's a Japanese army helmet. You're also going to find artifacts like this, and this is the president's wheelchair. I'm going to try this again here. Oop, did it again. Okay. This is a model of the president's wheelchair. And what you're going to notice about this, let me get some of these things off the back here, is that it's nothing more than a kitchen chair made into a wheelchair. The legs have been cut off, and it's been put on a metal frame, the big wheels in the front, the little wheels in the back, and there's no arms on this chair. It's nothing more than a kitchen chair. And the reason there's no arms on the chair is so that FDR could use this chair to get from one spot to the other, and then he would slip off and get into a more comfortable chair. And he designed this wheelchair himself. He also designed it to have over here on the side the ever-present ashtray, because FDR was a big-time smoker. And we always tell the students, FDR was a big-time smoker, and today he's dead. Okay, so don't pick up the habit there. Now, have you ever gotten some pocket change and you see who's on the dime? Who's on the dime? On our coins, who's on the dime? Well, it's none other than FDR. Okay, FDR is on the dime, and we're going to use our special 3D to show you this. Okay, ooh, hope nobody's prone to motion sickness. But look at that. FDR is on the dime, and he's on the dime because he created a thing called the March of Dimes. In order to help fight infantile paralysis, he had people send dimes to the White House, and they collected over 16 million dimes, and they used that money to help fight infantile paralysis. So the next time you get some pocket change, you're going to notice that FDR is on the dime, and he's on there as a tribute to creating the March of Dimes. The third category of things you're going to find in our collection are things like photographs. And here's a picture of Fala, FDR's dog. And we saw some of his toys a moment ago, so you're going to find pictures of that. You're going to find pictures of Mrs. Roosevelt, who was the First Lady at the time. And you're also going to find pictures of FDR starting from when he's a little kid. And notice he's wearing a Navy suit. We'll get back to that in a couple of minutes. And then here he is when he's about 14 years old, looking pretty dapper and dashing. And then here he is as a young man of about 20 years old, looking even more dapper and more dashing. And here he is, as we're probably more familiar with him, as President of the United States. So a lot of times people think, well, is it only just good stuff about the president that's in a presidential library? And it's not. Well, we have our collections of all types of things. And in fact, I want to share with you a poster. What did I do? Here it is. This is a poster when FDR was thinking about breaking that term limit that President Washington had put on there, right? He put on that 2-term limit as a tradition. Well, Roosevelt was thinking about running for a 3rd term, and not even the Democrats wanted him to run. Some Democrats didn't want him to run for a 3rd term. Some Democrats were wanting to even have President Wilkie run, or not President Wilkie, but candidate Wilkie run for president instead of President Roosevelt running for a 3rd term. So what you're going to see in our collections are not just things that are very supportive and happy and making the president look good, but you're going to see things that are negative about the president and things that are kind of critical of the president as well. Now, before we talk about Roosevelt a little bit more closely, there's a couple things we need to understand about him. First of all, he contracted polio when he was 39 years old, and almost his entire political career happened after he contracted polio. So he ran for governor of New York, and he ran for president of the United States, and he did both of those jobs with polio. And he had to be, in the wheelchair or, seated in a more comfortable chair. So everything he did with the burden of not being able to walk. And he was president during two important periods in American history. The first being the Great Depression, and the second being World War II. And, you know, during the Great Depression, this is how some people lived. This is a picture of a migrant woman with her baby and her child, and look at the dishes that she has on her table here. And she's living in a tent. And this is the way people lived all across the country because they lost their jobs. They lost their homes. They lost their livelihood. They lost their savings. And they were put out, in many cases, on the street. Some of them were homeless. Some of them lived in places called Hoovervilles, which were nothing more than tent cities where they found cardboard, burlap, canvas, old cars, whatever they could live in. They lived in for a time there until FDR created the New Deal programs and began to get people back into jobs and such. Okay? So that was an example of that. He was also president during the Second World War, and here he is examining a picture of a ship, because we needed to have ships in order to get the men and supplies across the oceans. And here he is with what's called the Big Three: Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. These were the big three leaders during the Second World War. So he was president during those two great crises. But he also had two dress rehearsals for the presidency. A dress rehearsal gives you an opportunity to kind of do the job or the role before you actually get there. And the first was that he was the governor of the state of New York during the first 4 years of the Great Depression. So what that means is that he was able to try out many of the what we call New Deal programs as small experiments here in New York State first. So things like the Civilian Conservation Corps were tried out here in New York State first. Things like the Tennessee Valley Authority was first tried out as the St. Lawrence Seaway Project up in upstate New York. Some of the work programs, the WPA, tried out as small experiments here in New York. Some of the things like the fireside chats were also, tried out here as small experiments. And I would bet your fireside school, you think, is it named after a fireside chat, do you think? No?
Yeah. No, probably not. It's named after our band is. Our band is. We have different levels of bands in our school. The highest is England, the middle is Delano, and the last is Roosevelt.
Oh, that's awesome. That is really awesome. So he had these two dress rehearsals for these two great crises, and then the other thing is he's the only president ever to be elected to 4 terms. So he broke that tradition of being president for just 2 terms, and he ran in 1932 when the nation was in the throes of the Great Depression, and he brought in the new programs. Then he ran again for re-election in 1936, and he won a big landslide because his New Deal programs were helping people out. Then he decided to run in 1940. And in 1940, he decided to run because he was worried about 2 things. The first thing was that his New Deal programs had begun to be challenged in the courts. Now, you're probably hearing a lot right now about the Supreme Court with Justice Anton Scalia just having died about a week or so ago. So now they're, going to maybe, figure out how they're going to get somebody else there on the court. Well, the Supreme Court is very powerful because it can strike down legislation that's passed by the Congress and then signed by the president. And that was what was going on during FDR's time. In fact, there was a program called the National Recovery Association, and that was a program that tried to get businesses to work together to sort of set prices and amounts of provisions and production that they were producing so that they wouldn't flood the market with goods and that they would keep the prices at a reasonable level. And this was declared unconstitutional. The president and the Congress didn't have the right to set those kinds of things, according to the Supreme Court. So by the time he was running for the second term, many of these programs began to be challenged. So he was afraid if he didn't run for a third term that somebody else would come into office and all of his New Deal programs would be taken apart. So that was one of the reasons he ran for the third term. The other reason he ran for the third term was because of a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler. Hitler was beginning to take over Germany, and then he wanted to take over the rest of the world. And one of the very cool things about history is that Franklin Roosevelt, the good guy, and Adolf Hitler, the bad guy, come to power within 5 weeks of each other, and they die within 3 weeks of each other. So they're on the world stage as good and evil at almost precisely the same time. And so he was worried about what was going on with Hitler, so he ran for the third term. And by the time the fourth term came along, he decided that because we were in the throes of the war, he was going to continue on with the presidency to see us through the war. So he expanded presidential powers because he was able to be there for 12 years. He had a lot of time in order to do things in office. And because of the two great crises that he was fighting, first the Great Depression and then the Second World War, he needed to take action. He needed to do things. And I want to show you, have you guys ever seen the periodic table of the elements in science class? All right, you've seen that?
Yes.
Well, I want to show you this. This is the periodic table of the New Deal. And what Roosevelt did was he created about 44 New Deal programs. And if you ask most people, can you name some New Deal programs? They'll say things like the CCC, the WPA, the FDIC, ESPN, QVC. Oh, wait a minute. Those last two aren't FDR programs. Those are TV stations. So he created 44 programs of the New Deal. And these programs impacted people in business, in finance, in farming, in housing, in railroad industries, and a whole bunch of other programs and such. So these were a lot of programs. And in the first 100 days he was president, he passed 16 major pieces of legislation. Now today, if a president gets 2 or 3 things passed in the course of a year, that's considered to be a really, a successful year. But FDR was able to pass 16 pieces of legislation in just the first 100 days. The Bank Act took just 8 hours to go from the president's desk through the House, through the Senate, and back to the president for his signature. So this was one big thing that he did. But another big thing he had to deal with was World War II. And we have the periodic table of World War II as well. So World War II was a huge battle. It took place on 5 continents. 60 million people were killed in World War II in just a little over 5.5 years. That's a lot of people to be killed in a war. And so FDR was the leader of the Allied countries during the Second World War, and he was able to create alliances. And as the war began to wind down, he decided that we should create a thing called the United Nations. And it was based on an ideal from Woodrow Wilson called the League of Nations. And he wanted the nations of the world to get together and talk about issues and problems before they began shooting at each other. And what he was trying to do was prevent a third world war. And the United Nations is one of those ways that FDR changed not only the country, but the world. And he created the United Nations, which still operates in New York. They've had some limited successes in some things. They've had some great successes in others. But they have managed to create that goal that FDR had, which was to prevent a third global world war from occurring up to that time. So FDR expanded this through domestic programs. He expanded the government through international programs like Lend-Lease, things like being the arsenal of democracy, creating the United Nations, the 4 freedoms. And one of the ways that he dealt with people and got them to understand what he was doing and got them to agree with what he was doing was by the use of radio. He gave his fireside chats, and he gave these speeches over the radio that were very easy for people to listen to. They were concise, they used straight talk, and he was able to explain to them what he was doing through the New Deal programs and also through the strategies of World War II. And because he was talking to people, people understood what he was saying, and they supported him. They understood what it was he was trying to do. And he got a lot of support from people. In fact, he would get sometimes as many as 5,000 letters a day coming into the White House. Now, Herbert Hoover, who was president before him, only got about 5,000 letters a week But FDR got 5,000 letters a day from people supporting him and giving him advice and talking with him about their problems so that he was able to understand those and be able to enact these various programs and such. So FDR used the media to expand his power. He used the crises of the Great Depression and the Second World War to expand his power. He also reorganized the government. And by creating the government to be larger and creating agencies and programs that would help us, what he did was he expanded the role of government, and he expanded our need for being involved with the government. And so what he did was he changed the nature of the way you and I interact with the government. Today, we expect the government to fix our economy. We expect the government to take care of our food supply. We expect the government to take care of our water supply. We expect the government to educate us. We expect the government to create job opportunities for us. And these were things that didn't really exist, or people didn't have that expectation for the government to do that prior to Franklin Roosevelt's time in president. But today, they do. So now let's open it up to some questions and answers, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you might have. I hope that you found the presentation so far to be interesting and to be insightful. But what about some questions? Enough yakking from me. Anybody? Yes. Yes. Sir, there at McCann Tech.
You said that Franklin Roosevelt did those fireside chats. How often did he do them?
That's a great question. He did about 39 fireside chats over the course of the 12 years that he was president, and that comes out to about an average of about every 6 months. And, you know, unlike today with our saturation of media where you see the president all the time, when Roosevelt gave these fireside chats, people would plan their days and their weeks around them so they were able to hear these fireside chats. The fireside chats were delivered usually at 10 o'clock Eastern time so that the parents could get their kids in bed and listen uninterrupted by the children. And on the West Coast, that would be about 7 o'clock time so they could get the kids dinner and then get them out into the yard to play. So we gave those fireside chats about every 6 months or so, and there's an old saying that you could walk down a street in New York and listen to a fireside chat just by walking down the street because everybody had it on the radio and you could hear it as you passed from house to house to house. They were big media events, and they were the opportunity for the president to talk directly to the people and for the people then to directly respond back to him with letters and telegrams over the days that followed. Great question. Yes, sir. Right there. Yes.
You say that he got 5,000 letters a day. What exactly were these letters about? Were they like various topics, or were they advice on World War II, or what?
That's a great question. These they were on all kinds of various topics. Sometimes people would write the letter to the president to complain about something. You know, I heard your speech last night. I think you're going too far. I don't think we should do that. I think, you're making a mistake. Sometimes people would write a letter to the president and they would ask for help. There's a famous letter in our collection of a little girl who writes to the Mrs. Roosevelt, and she says she saw in a magazine that Mrs. Roosevelt got a new fur coat. And this little girl is very clever and very resourceful, so she says, if Mrs. Roosevelt got a new fur coat, that must mean she had an old fur coat. And the little girl writes Mrs. Roosevelt a letter asking if she can have the old fur coat for her mom. Right? And so people were giving advice to the president. They were sharing their stories with the president. They were asking for help through the president. And it really gave President Roosevelt a sense of what people were up against, in North Adams, Massachusetts, or in Phoenix, Arizona, or in Hyde Park, New York, or in, Philadelphia or Texas, or in many of the other places around the country. There was a real connection of Roosevelt to the people in the country. And it came through those fireside chats, and it came through those letters that went back to the president that day. And you know something? If you wrote a letter to President Obama today and you mailed it to the White House, it would be kept and cataloged. And when he opens his presidential library in Chicago, that letter will be there, and you can go and look that letter up in the archives. So it might be something you might want to do as a class. Anything else? Yes, sir. McCann Tech in the back there.
Did that little girl ever get the fur coat?
No, good question. She didn't get the fur coat. Because the Roosevelts were getting 5,000 letters a day asking for help and resources, they were powerless to be able to answer each letter, and they were powerless to be able to answer and solve those questions and problems. But everybody did get a letter from at least one of the president's secretaries. Mrs. Roosevelt would try to answer about 150 letters herself each week. And the other letters were answered through secretaries, and they might say, well, we're not unable to give you the fur coat. However, if you go to, X Center in North Adams, you can find there is a clothing bank there where you might be able to get a warm coat for the winter, or you might be able to get food at a food bank. So they did send back addresses and locations locally where those people could get help, but they weren't able to answer each question with sending their own supplies and help to the folks. Yes.
Yeah, we had talked a lot about in class about critics of the New Deal and how a lot of people felt that Roosevelt went too far in his attempts to manage the economy. I was hoping, we had literally just finished this unit in class, I was hoping you might be able to shed some light on some of the critical aspects of Roosevelt's presidency, especially within the first 100 days.
Okay. Sure. The Great Depression hit, and 25% of the people were out of work. And you always hear about the Great Depression from an economic standpoint, but it was way more than that. It wasn't just an economic problem. It was a social and emotional problem as well. And those of you folks, you guys are probably a little old to get an allowance, but the folks at the Fireside School, maybe you guys get an allowance from your mom and dad. Now imagine if all of a sudden your mom and dad said, we're not going to give you an allowance anymore, right? How are you going to buy your video games? How are you going to go to the movies? How are you going to buy candy? The answer is you're not. And so it wasn't just an economic thing. People were literally depressed. The suicide rate tripled during the Great Depression. And so what Roosevelt wanted to do was to create these job programs because he wanted to give people not just some money to help stimulate the economy, but he wanted to give them a purpose, something that they could get up in the morning and say, okay, today I'm going to get up and I'm going to do this. You're a teacher, so, God forbid, but if you lost your job as a teacher, you identify yourself as a teacher, but if you lost your job, are you still a teacher? Well, you're an out-of-work teacher. If you're not baking bread, but you're a baker, you're not really a baker. If you're a fireman who's lost his job, you're not really a fireman. So people tend to identify themselves by their professions, by their jobs, and that's why the jobs were so important. Now, what a lot of people thought was that the market mechanisms, Adam Smith's invisible hand, supply and demand, production and distribution, were going to take care of these problems that were in the economy, and they didn't think that Roosevelt should be tinkering with those mechanisms. But what had happened was, after the stock market crashed in October of 1929, and that was where everybody suddenly paid attention. The Depression had actually been going on, especially for farmers, for almost 10 years before that. And what had happened was the market had gotten saturated with automobiles and radios and appliances, and so there wasn't a demand for that anymore. So what Roosevelt did was began these various programs, things like the Bank Act, the first piece of legislation passed, which shut down the banks. Now, that's incredible for the government to step in and say, we're going to shut down the banks. And what he did was he shut them down for a week where they could go through and with the bank examiners find out which banks were soluble, which ones were not, and open up the ones that were strong and firm. And the way this works is, now we have the FDIC. So when you put money in the bank, it's guaranteed to be there. It's not going to go anyplace. Even if the bank closes, the government guarantees your money back. It wasn't like that during the Great Depression. And I remember my grandmother always pictures of my grandma with this big black pocketbook. And that was always the funny thing. Oh, Granny's always got this big black pocketbook. So I was talking to my mom one day, and she said, well, you know what Granny had in there, right? And I said, no, what did she have? And my mother said Granny had about $20,000 cash in that pocketbook. And it was because she had lost money in a bank during the Great Depression, and she never trusted banks again. So there was a lot of controversy about, does the government have the right to come in and shut down privately owned banks for a week? So that was one critical thing. Does the government have the right to come in and create job programs? Shouldn't the market be creating those jobs? Shouldn't the private sector be creating those jobs? Should the government come in with things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act and pay farmers not to produce? Pay them not to grow corn, pay them not to grow wheat, not to grow cotton, because they were saturating the market with that and driving the prices down. There were concerns about whether the government should have the right to come in and set minimum wages and maximum hours of working. So these are all things that had traditionally been done through the market mechanisms and let business and industry sort of take care of those things themselves. But now the government was stepping in, and FDR was making that the role of the government to secure your bank accounts, to make sure that you had a 40-hour week, to make sure that you had a minimum wage, to make sure that you had safe working conditions, to make sure that you could create a union so that if you didn't have safe working conditions, you could, had the right to strike and the right to work for those things. And these were all huge, huge departures. It used to be in the old days, prior to the Great Depression, if you had a problem, let's say, you lost your job, you would depend upon your family maybe to support you or to try to find you a job. But during the Great Depression, families couldn't do that. So maybe you would go to your church or your civic organization, and maybe they'd be able to help you out. But during the Great Depression, so many people needed help, they weren't able to help out. So maybe you go to your county or your town or your state to try to get help from them. They couldn't help you out because they were helping out so many other people. So it finally came to be that they had to look to the federal government to solve those problems. And that was a huge departure for folks. And that's one of the criticisms that still remains today, that President Roosevelt, got the government so involved in people's lives that there's too much government regulation, there's too much government involvement, and what that does is suppress the ability of people to do things on their own. So that was one of the criticisms. Now, at the same time that the political right was criticizing him for doing too much, the political left was criticizing him for not doing enough. That instead of creating a system like Social Security, that they should do more than that. That it shouldn't just be job programs, and benefits if you lost your job, but it should be health benefits too. And of course, it takes all the way up to President Obama to get the health care portion of Social Security passed. So the president was getting criticism from both the political left and the political right. And he knew that when it was about balanced, that he was probably doing the programs exactly where they ought to be. I don't know if that answers your question. Anything else?
Yes, that's great.
Great. Right back there in the back there, Buster.
So, you said Roosevelt was reelected 4 times. Would he be allowed to do that, or wouldn't the Congress shut him down and not allow him to do that anymore?
George Washington, the Constitution doesn't set a term limit on the presidency. And so George Washington was elected president, then he was elected president for a second time, and at the end of his second term, he said, okay, it's time for somebody else. We don't want another king. That's what we just had, and we got rid of that. It's time to let somebody else be president. And then that was the tradition that was followed from George Washington all the way on up to Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt ran for a third term because there was no law that prevented him from running for a third term. And then he ran for a fourth term because there was no law preventing him from running for a fourth term. But what that meant was that the Democrats had the White House for almost over 20 years during the first part of the 20th century. And by the late 1940s, the Senate had been taken over and the Congress had been taken over by Republicans. And so what they did was they created a constitutional amendment. And I'm not saying it was just the Republicans, but the Republicans led this movement to create a constitutional amendment which was passed, I think, in 1951 and went into effect in 1953, which now limits the president to 2 full terms. So if you're president, you can have up to 2 years of somebody else's term. Like, let's say, God forbid, President Obama died, right? So then that would mean that Joe Biden would take over this remaining year of his presidency, and then Joe Biden, who's the vice president, would then be enabled and able to get 2 terms of his own. So the most you can be president now is 10 years. The 22nd Amendment caps it at 10 years. So there was no laws against that during Roosevelt's time. President Truman would have been the last president to be able to run for a 3rd term. Today we cap the presidency at 2 terms, and President Obama is coming out to the end of his 2nd term, and he's going to retire the presidency in a little bit less than a year from now. So these presidential libraries, boys and girls, are great places to get information about the presidency, not just about the president's term in office, but about the presidency in general. And as I said earlier, there's about 14, there's going to be 14 of these things all around the country. And they're a really cool way to learn about what's going on. And you can go to our website, www.fdrlibrary.marist, marist.edu, and you can visit our website. We have a virtual tour of our museum there. We have a thing called Franklin, where you can search over 1 million pages of documents just by typing in a word search, and you're able to find that information. And there's activities and things you can do there as well. Yes, sir.
So, say Obama did not make a presidential library, would it be required for the next person after him to make a presidential library for him, or would the person after him just put the documents in his own presidential library?
That's a great question. Well, what happened was Roosevelt built the first presidential library, and then every president since then has gone back and built a presidential library. And then in 1980s, Congress passed a law which now creates this idea of what's called a presidential library system. It sort of made it official. So now what happens is the documents go into the White House, they're kept and they're cataloged, and they become an important part of the public record. So if you want to look at the Obama documents from when President Obama was president, those are kept in a special collection. Now, if President Obama decided not to build a presidential library, those documents would be housed at the National Archives down in Washington, D.C., or out in Washington, D.C. But he will probably he's already planning to build a presidential library, and his documents will be housed there. President Roosevelt thought that it would be a good idea to have presidential libraries across the country, because if you put everything in Washington, D.C., and there was a fire, or the Washington, D.C. got attacked, like he was afraid it was going to happen during World War II, then all those papers would be lost. So by spreading them around, they're in a bunch of different places. So presidents generally like to build presidential libraries because it gives them an opportunity to sort of sort through their stuff and to sort of lay out, for people what they were trying to do during their presidency. Anything else? Any questions from McCann Tech? Let me ask the McCann Tech folks a question. So there were 44 programs of the New Deal. What was the thing that tied all those programs together? What were the 3 things that tied all the programs together? Anybody know? You'll know them as soon as I say the first one. Relief?
Is the question relating to who's carrying out the programs?
Well, there was a wide variety of programs, and what were the sort of the 3 themes that kind of went through all those programs? If you had to remember one thing about the Great Depression and the New Deal programs, you're not going to remember 44 programs, but what would be the theme that ran through all those?
Relief, reform, recover.
Right. Relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, how do we bring about immediate assistance to people? Recovery, how do we get back into swing of things? And reform, how do we prevent stuff from happening again? That's what Roosevelt was looking to do. He wasn't necessarily looking to expand the government just for the sake of expanding government. He wasn't looking to create programs just for the sake of creating programs. He wasn't necessarily looking to get involved in all those topics just to get involved in those topics. What he was trying to do was to bring about immediate relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, things like, the CCC, getting people jobs right away. Recovery, getting the people back on the farms, back in the factories, and reform, the SCC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, FDIC, so these problems didn't happen again. That's what he was looking to do. So when you're thinking about the Great Depression and the New Deal, try to think about it in terms of relief, recovery, and reform. Those were the three main things that he was looking to do. And one of the most important things he did was create this one, which is Social Security. And this was his favorite domestic program, Social Security. And he created this, and it helped about 35 million people with benefits. And if you talk to your grandma and grandpa today, they're going to be really big fans of Social Security because it helps them out when it comes time at the end of the month. If you run out of some money, you've got a Social Security check that comes and helps you out with that. Or if, let's say, your mom or dad passed away, you might be able to get some benefits for that to help, with babysitters and schools and those kinds of things. So these were some ways that he helped to try to help people out and to look to try to help people out. Any final questions or comments or snide remarks? Great. Every president since Roosevelt has lived in the shadow of FDR because he expanded that role of the government, because he created these programs that are still going on today. Every president has had to wrestle with the fact that they are in charge of a large portion of making sure the economy works. They are in charge of international alliances and relations and things. We're a world leader economically, we're a world leader militarily, and a lot of that came out of the Roosevelt era. So when you look at the country today, much of what we're doing today was created and started during that Roosevelt era and has been expanded and kept going and amended in many ways over the course of the administrations from Roosevelt on up to today. And that's why it's so important to understand this part of American history, because it really sets the tone for what goes on for the next 80 years. I mean, these guys were in office 75 or 80 years ago. We're still talking about them today.